Today is Thursday, the 6th of June, and those who have been following the spatio-temporal moment discussion on our YouTube channel, Golden Phoenix Published, may recognize this as what we might call the STM flower. And that flower consists of a central jewel, or we might think of it as a jewel in the midst, followed by 6 interpenetrative other STMs. So we have the nucleus of a central one. We have 6 interpenetrative on the horizontal level. And then if you look at it from this angle, you can see what it would look like on a vertical level. So all I need to do is rotate. What we're going to do today is, because it's been a while since I've covered this, and I've been giving a lot of thought to this entire notion, so I thought I might review and maybe upgrade some of the terminology. Effectively, what we are talking about is the fact that there has always been and will always be a kind of matrix throughout all of space that consists of STMs. This is just one little efflorescence of an STM. We'll call it a community or a neighborhood that just goes off infinitely into space. And who knows how large or small they may be. They're probably extremely tiny. You could probably get, let's say this entire neighborhood could be collapsed down into probably a nucleus, or probably even more so a neutron in the nucleus of an atom when they become entangled. And I'll explore that a little more fully as we go along. So what we're going to call this is spatio-temporal fundamentals. And I am going to basically just give you each of the items on this index card and maybe expand a bit on them so we can get up to speed. So we're going to call this video spatio-temporal fundamentals. It's basically going to say something like this, as I've just mentioned on this first card. All of space is replete with spatio-atemporal moments. We're going to call them SAMs, or Samanthas. And these moments have always existed, will always exist, but before any energy ever makes contact with them, and we'll talk about energization in a moment, they are completely and utterly passive. So there's no time. They just exist without change all throughout space, and it's not until they are energized that that event, which we call time, occurs. So they exist in 3 dimensions. And the way to think of them in 3 dimensions is, if I take this little flower and I rotate it along this axis, instead of thinking it as being a flat plane here, we can perceive them as being a vertical plane here. So the same STM at center of this neighborhood is now become a center of a vertical neighborhood. And that gives rise to a number count. And we'll touch upon that later on. Okay. As I mentioned, all of space is complete with, or replete with, these spatio-atemporal moments, SAMs. Such moments have always existed and always will exist. However, on contact with energy, now we're not talking about photons here, we're just talking about some mysterious thing we're calling energy. SAMs, spatio-atemporal moments, become spatio-temporal moments, STMs. And the way that works is they begin to oscillate, individually and collectively as a group. And that oscillation is instantly transmitted to other STM efflorescences in the form of what scientists call a photon. So we could almost think of this as being the ether, but it's not the ether, because it is not something that it's not something that's actually fluidic. It just has fluidic properties. And the Michelson-Morley experiment, if I look into it more, may not have been able to make a distinction between these spatio-temporal moments and something that was considered to be fluidic through space. So that requires a little more thought in the future. You can hear the air conditioning going on behind me. It's extremely warm here in Tucson, Arizona at this point. We're experiencing a heat blanket that's moved in off the Pacific Ocean. It's partially is associated with global warming, but it also has to do with an El Nino event, which is pushing the temperatures up in the Pacific Ocean. Apparently, in the Pacific Ocean, there's a great cycling of heat that goes from below deep in the ocean to the surface and returns again, a great convective cycling. And that, for me, is just an example of what I call stressor theory. And stressor theory is that nobody likes to be stressed. Stress is a hot potato, and it gets passed on to someone else when you receive it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So we've covered card 1. Spatio-temporal fundamentals is the basic topic. And card 1 talked mostly about spatio-atemporal moments, which existed before there was any energy release in the cosmos to create everything around us. What about an energizing source? Energy should be considered the activating principle of SAMs, transforming them into STMs. In other words, something causes a tremendous amount of disruption in the normally stable state of SAMs so that they feel the necessity to do a couple of things. One is transmit the energy downstream to its neighbors. And for instance, if that energy were to purely make contact right at the nucleus of this particular SAM, right here in the middle, it would instantly propagate in all directions, going out in space and becoming time. So for some reason, if you were to be able to somehow direct energy right to this little nucleus right here, that energy would blow out in all directions like an explosion, a great wave. However, if you put too much energy in there, we create a situation where something could happen to materialize or particulate this cluster of spatio-temporal moments, so that they would become either a very short-lived or a very long-lived form of matter. And we're not going to talk much about that until towards the end. Okay, now what about the energizing source? So the activation of SAMs transforms them into STMs, but energy may activate SAMs vertically from what we might call a higher dimension. There's a lot of talk about dimensionality in physics these days, especially with string theory. And that may be one way of describing the energizing source. I do not know. I just simply tend to think of the energizing source as a transcendental. We don't know what it is. It requires investigation, and potentially it requires meditation. In other words, we may objectively begin to explore the idea of an energizing source from beyond the 4 dimensions of our normal experience, but we may also somehow be able to get in touch with it from within ourselves. I don't know. We call that consciousness. We'll get towards that at the end. So energy received from the energizing source may be vertical from a higher dimension. This type of energy, but most types of energies activating SAMs are horizontal in 3-dimensional space. That means they're simply being propagated. So the best way to think about that is, imagine a wave of energy coming in from where my hand is and making contact with these STMs. What you'd see is a wave or an oscillation that would pass through them, be passed along. Now, why is it doing it? Well, that gets us back to stressor theory. Energy causes stress. Stress must be handed off to neighbors to be properly dissipated. Otherwise, the energy can do what we might consider constructive or destructive things with these STMs. Constructive would mean they become entangled with themselves, creating particles. Those particles may endure, like protons and electrons, or they may be temporal if isolated in space like a neutron, but they could be any kind of particle that might be created and may only last for billionths of a second before it would then fall back into a normal STM modality. Next, we're going to talk about horizontal energization. Okay, during horizontal energization, as I've already mentioned, Horizontal energy is received by one or more STMs by way of neighboring STMs. So if you imagine this is just a SAM, or a spatio-temporal moment matrix, they would just be sitting there with a potential without any sense of oscillation among them. But, as I mentioned before, if a wave of activity were to come in from another direction, disturbing these SAMs, they would become spatio-temporal moments as a photon passes through. Now don't think of a photon as just passing through as a wave here. That oscillation could go on for meters, potentially even miles across space. But the longer the wavelength, the more gentle the stimulation. The shorter the wavelength, the more radical the stimulation. And the most radical forms of stimulation could cause a collapse of STMs to form, as I mentioned, subatomic particles. Once energized, STMs discharge their energy to return towards SAM status. Now, in our universe, there's no such thing as SAMs that we can see, because we have the thing called the cosmic microwave background radiation, the CMBR. So astronomers know that there's an oscillation constantly going on throughout space. It's about 2.5 degrees above absolute zero. So it's in the microwave, cosmic microwave background radiation frequency. So that's out there everywhere in space that we can see. So there's probably no such thing as a SAM anywhere in our space, only STMs. The downstream discharge of STMs accounts for what contemporary physics calls photons, and I've already mentioned that, which can last across even miles of STMs with a gentle oscillation up and down, like water in a basin being disturbed by a vibrating hand. Next discussion is vertical energization. All right, vertical energization is a mysterious thing. We're going to consider that to be a transcendental. In other words, we can't know anything about vertical energization. Basically, it comes from a dimension beyond the three or four dimensions of space and time. That dimensionality may or may not exist. It's a hypothetical. There could be something that totally has nothing to do with strings, or there could be strings that are part of this. It really doesn't matter. Let's just call it a transcendental until you get in touch with it either objectively, scientifically, by measurement, which I kind of find very challenging, or somehow subjectively through your own contemplations, for instance. You can't have a sense of what it is. But I will tell you, later on we will discuss the impact of vertical stimulation on STMs as a thing we might call consciousness. So the more conscious you are, the more you might be able to get in touch with vertical energization principle. Okay, vertical energization encounters SAMs from a transcendental source. Such a source may activate SAMs locally or universally. Now, a local activation, in other words, there's a certain dimensionality to it. There's a range in which it might occur. A transcendental source may actually focus itself on the most narrowest realm into the nuclei of a single SAM or STM. It may focus itself on an entire neighborhood, or an entire community, or an entire city, or an entire state, if you wish. We're just talking in sociological terms. An entire continent, an entire planet, who knows? But there is a form of vertical, transcendental source of vertical energization that could happen over any range and for any given period of time. So we're just going to say they could be very local or universal in form. Both forms of vertical activization are temporally bound and may be withdrawn immediately or over a longer period of time. In other words, it could be a very short-lived phenomena of vertical activization or a very, very long-term, slow activization principle. And that's that discussion after having already discussed horizontal energization, which happens in waves passing from community neighborhoods along the STM matrix. fabric of space. So what are the effects of STM activation? Normal SAM activation, spatio-temporal moment activation, results in the horizontal propagation of photons of energy. An excess of SAM activation can result in their entanglement to form particles. We've already mentioned this. And particularization may be temporary or semi-permanent based on the degree of STM entanglement and the intent behind whatever the source of the transcendental is. Now, we can't even begin to explore intentionality in this regard. All I would mention is that there's a principle in Greek philosophy called teleology. And teleology is a principle that says the future is creating the present out of the past. And we may get a little more into this as we go along. So the effects of STM activation. Let's have some cosmological insights. Cosmological insights. There never was an era in which SAMs did not exist. Okay, we posited that. There never will be an era in which SAMs do not exist. We're positing that. There's no way of proving this one way or another. We're just using as baseline assumptions. Our universe came into existence when a massive vertical energization occurred in the now long distant past. So there was probably an instant back at the very beginning of what we call the Big Bang universe, in which a massive amount of energy was released cosmologically and vertically from a transcendental source that caused massive waves of particulate generation. Some of the particulates were able to form long-term material relationships. We call these the primordial atoms or non-metallic astronomical metals. And this would be something like hydrogen or helium, possibly small amounts of lithium, maybe beryllium. Very small particles, and basically the way that would work is energization would create neutrons. Neutrons would then break down into protons and electrons with antineutrinos. Neutrons and protons and electrons could be bound together to form atomic nuclei and atomic structures. Some of these structures may have become molecular. I doubt it because they would have been highly ionized at the time. However, going on from then, our universe will go out of existence once that energization is withdrawn or abstracted. In other words, energy, even though it can be transcendentally, vertically applied, and can be horizontally expressed as waves of energization which we call photons, at some point that oscillation, that energization could be withdrawn, once again intentionally by who knows what, but the point is that's something we're positing here as a fundamental principle that needs to be explored. So those are some of the cosmological insights. Let's look at some implications. Cosmological implications associated with STMs and SAMs. We can think of time as the playing out of energization on the fabric of space. Remember, the fabric of space was the SAMs to begin with, which became STMs once energy was applied and caused them to begin to oscillate. Okay, that which physicists call entropy is the result of a dearth of vertical energization. So let's say you apply a bunch of vertical energy from a transcendental source and you just dam it up and stop it. Well, you're going to have all kinds of energy still racing around the cosmos horizontally, but over time it's going to be dissipated, spread out normally. And what that means is the impetus to form new particles is going to be lost, and all the particles that exist are going to spread themselves out through space, as well as throughout the STMs of space. You're going to have a gentle oscillation, which is just normally over time going to dissipate and spread out until everything becomes a great cosmic soup. That is called the principle of entropy. And it explains the arrow of time, doesn't it? That which philosophers call consciousness, aha, new principle, is the result of combined vertical and horizontal energization. And that requires a good deal of expression. So basically what we're saying is, it's possible that this transcendental source that originally ignited the existence of a material universe and set all the oscillations of the STMs into motion is gently and quietly behind the scenes continuing to energize STMs. And that continuous energization of STMs is basically the future creating the present out of the past through consciousness. And consciousness we can describe as simply this effect we have in our own subjective effect that we can cause or bring about changes in ourselves, in the world around us, and others. And so let's just say that if energy is flowing through us quietly and diligently into our neuronal structures, we have this sense of being aware, that we can take this awareness and turn it towards objectives, and we can materialize those objectives through our attention to the world around us using basic principles of hard work, effort, and persistence. So, what we call consciousness is the result of combined vertical and horizontal energization, energy coming at us and energy evolving from within ourselves. Okay, continuing. That which transcendentalists call spirit. Okay, so now we're talking metaphysics here. And the best we can do is by getting in touch with ourselves consciously, we can consider a principle called spirit. And spirit is the source of all counter-entropic activity in the cosmos. In other words, if we go back to that principle of teleology, the future creates the present out of the past. The present is the status of all STMs universally right now. The past is the status previously, and the future will be the results of future either entropic effects leading towards whatever kind of fate may exist in the universe, a downward staircase of spiral towards a lower activization state, or if there's continued activization through consciousness of the vertical, it could be like a stair step going up. We will call that destiny. So the continued application of the vertical energies that cause STM activation results in something we might call destiny, and the absence of that vertical influence is something we might call fate. Okay, the interplay between passive SAMs and transcendental spirit creates all things great and small. All right, that's a teleological principle, the future creating the present out of the past, or the past overwhelming the future energies coming down, creating a perpetual state of inversion in which everything falls into a lower state of entropy. Now, however, here's the gotcha. The interplay between the vertical and horizontals and the STMs and conscious and everything else is what we call stress. And stress may be both creative and destructive simultaneously. We see all kinds of events happening on the planet where good things seem to be happening and bad things seem to be happening. And all of that is the interplay, if we might think of it, between vertical, horizontal influences, STMs, playing out in space and time, bringing about both creative and destructive events, which are very, very stressful. Okay, stress must be carefully and consciously managed to avoid destructive tendencies that are not in alignment with what we might consider the teleological principle of the future creating the present out of the past. So all we can do is, in the face of stress, is peace, bro, peace, sis, and that's it for this discussion of spatio-temporal fundamentals, working their way out through the flower of SAMs in the cosmos.